I'm VJ Hamilton and welcome to the Autoimmune Reset, the place for you to learn how to thrive with autoimmune disease and feel empowered to take steps to transform your health to feel better than ever. You can start making changes today to improve your health. So with every episode, my mission is to share with you simple ways to up-level your diet and lifestyle with key learnings from my own journey reversing autoimmune disease and inspirational stories from those who have reset their autoimmune symptoms and are now thriving in life. I suffered from autoimmune disease for over 25 years and now I live symptom-free, and I wish the same for you as well. So thank you for being here and sharing this time with me. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Autoimmune Reset podcast. I'm your host, VJ Hamilton. I'm a nutritionist, scientist, and expert in autoimmune disease. And today's episode is actually inspired by a presentation that I delivered recently for Lambert's Healthcare. And as I was preparing for it, I kept thinking, this is something you would probably want to understand too, especially if you are experiencing hair loss, because hair loss is one of those symptoms that can feel incredibly visible, incredibly personal, and often quite emotional when you're going through it, or if you have a loved one who is going through it as well. And yet, from a clinical perspective, it's rarely just about the hair itself. In fact, some of the most complex cases I see in clinic are people coming to me for hair loss because what we often uncover is that the hair is simply reflecting something much deeper within the body. And we can work on their gut health, we can improve the nutrient density in their diet, we can help to manage their stress levels, and even then we have to dig deeper. I would say 70% of my clients do well with that approach, but sometimes there might be chemical toxicity, mould toxicity, something else going on. There might be genetic variations which we haven't factored in. So there's often lots to think about, and I have never seen somebody who is experiencing hair loss that doesn't have some deeper imbalance which is potentially contributing to that hair loss. And once we work on those underlying imbalances, and that's what I did myself, you often find that the hair starts to grow back. And that happened for me. I had chronic fatigue syndrome for over 10 years from doing my A-levels or around that age until I was in my early 30s. And I was experiencing hair loss from 7 years old. The fatigue issue really presented itself as I got older. And I am sure that the two are linked because once I started getting my energy back, my hair grew back. And I have been able to maintain that now for over 10 years. And that's where I would like my clients to be as well. And if you're experiencing hair loss for the first time, or if you've just discovered a circular patch of hair loss and it's alopecia areata, then you need to be asking why. And that's what I want to explore with you today. Not just what causes hair loss, but what might it actually be telling us. And if we start with the biology, hair growth is an incredibly energy dependent process. Each individual hair follicle is one of the most metabolically active structures in the body, and the cells within it are dividing rapidly. They're producing keratin, which is what hair is made of, and it cycles through phases of growth, regression, rest, and shedding. And it's often when you notice a lot of shedding that clients will come to me and they are concerned. When I experienced hair loss, I didn't notice shedding as much. I became a bit more conscious of it as I got older. But when I was younger and I first started experiencing alopecia areata, I didn't really see shedding. I think you see shedding more with alopecia totalis or alopecia universalis. What I find with alopecia areata is people don't really even notice, and then somebody else notices. They might go to the hairdresser and they notice rather than noticing themselves. But it is certainly something to look for, and we just need to be appreciative of this growth cycle that hair goes through. And because of that, the follicle is exquisitely sensitive to changes in the internal environment. It responds to inflammation, it will respond to changes in hormones, it responds to nutrient availability, especially in that localized area. The hair follicle is like an organ, and we have about 100,000 to 150,000 hair follicles, and they are all mini little organs. They need a lot of nutrients, and I know one of the main things that people test is ferritin, when they experience hair loss. And that's because ferritin is telling you those iron stores. If you are looking at the other markers in your blood for iron, that is showing you systemically how well your body is coping with delivering iron to different organs and different places in the body. Ferritin is important for hair loss because the hair follicle requires so many nutrients, there's such a rapid turnover of cells and a high energy requirement that it needs those iron stores. It needs to be able to access iron quickly, or the hair growth cycle becomes impacted. And it's when the hair goes from that growth phase, which a large percentage of the hair should be in that growth phase, like 70 to 80%, moves into the telogen phase, the rest and shedding phase. And that's what we want to avoid as much as possible. In terms of the type of hair loss, it doesn't really matter when it comes to that. We need to be focused on the hair growth cycle for all different types of hair loss. It also responds to stress. Stress can be something that can be contributing to hair loss, and it could be contributing to other issues in your health over time, but it can also be the trigger. So you may have a fragile system for whatever reason, and then you go through stress in your life or grief in your life or something significant changes in your life, and then you notice hair loss. And yes, the stress piece is really important, but is that one of the underlying contributing factors as well? And that's what I work with clients to determine. The more we can manage stress, the better, because when we have high cortisol and our stress hormones are out of sync, it can impact different processes and systems in the body. So we need to be aware of that as well. When I'm working with clients, I'm always thinking about, well, what's the trigger here? And then going backwards and thinking about what were the contributing factors that have led to this over time. And they can be different things, and stress can be both. So when something shifts systemically, the hair is often one of the first places we see it. And this is why hair loss can be such an important clinical sign. One of the key areas I spoke about in the presentation was the immune system, because in conditions like alopecia areata, what we're seeing is not simply hair falling out, we're seeing an immune response directed toward the follicle, and that's what happens in an autoimmune condition. The immune system is targeting something specific, and when it comes to alopecia areata, the immune system is targeting the hair follicle, and that's why the hair falls out. Under normal conditions, the hair follicle is protected by something called immune privilege, and I often describe this as a kind of protective shield from the immune system, and it allows the follicle to grow and function without being constantly surveyed or attacked by the immune system. But that protection is not fixed. It is dependent on the internal environment in your body. And when the environment shifts, and that could be through inflammation, stress, infections, or immune dysregulation, that protective barrier can begin to break down. And what I find interesting is one of the ways that protective barrier can break down is through histamine and through mast cells. And when there is a lot of histamine activity and mast cell destabilization around the hair follicle, that again can cause a breakdown in that immune privilege. And that's potentially why people who have more allergy symptoms and are more prone to histamine are more likely to experience alopecia areata. I know from a clinical perspective, at least half of my clients that I work with who have alopecia have some issue with histamine, and it's something that I have to work on quite often, and it can be quite difficult to understand what might be contributing to it, whether it's to do with gut dysbiosis, candida, stress, genetics. There's all these things that need to be considered. And we work on those underlying factors to help to reduce the histamine load in the body. And I am actually going to be doing a presentation for Lambert's on histamine intolerance in May, because it's a subject that I've become very passionate in through working with clients who are experiencing this a lot. And when that immune privilege breaks down with hair loss, that is when autoimmune driven hair loss occurs, when we have that breakdown in the system. Now, stress is particularly an important piece of the puzzle, as I said. And when I say stress, I don't just mean emotional stress, although that absolutely plays a role. I'm also talking about physiological stress, because the body does not distinguish particularly well between different types of stress, whether it's a chronic infection, inflammation, blood sugar instability. You might have poor sleep or emotional strain from work or from family issues or just the demands of life. And it all feeds into that same system, which is the system of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. These are the endocrine glands which are at play when it comes to the nervous system and the stress response. And when the HPA axis becomes dysregulated, we start to see changes in cortisol patterns. We start to see changes in adrenal signaling as well. And the downstream effects of that are on the thyroid function. And the active thyroid hormone T3 is so important for hair growth. And if there is not optimal T3, then again, your body adjusts and goes into survival mode when it comes to the hair follicle, and it shifts everything into that resting shedding phase, which is the telogen phase. So that's why our stress can be a huge factor, especially when we have a dysregulated stress response. And looking back, I know I had a dysregulated stress response. I'm still working on my stress response now, but I had anxiety. I was sleeping in a very light sleep. I would wake up probably 6 times in the night. And honestly, I just thought that was normal at the time. Now I sleep through the night, and the first time I did that, it was absolutely unbelievable. And there are certain things that you can monitor to check if your stress response is working as it should do. And I think one of the ways that you can test for that is if somebody jumps up behind you and you get a fright, how long does it take you to get back to normal after that? Or if somebody annoys you when you're driving your car, are you able to get back to, feeling balanced again after that scenario? And the longer it takes you, the more likely it is that your stress response is dysregulated. So that's just something to think about. And all of these hormonal shifts can actually influence the hair cycle. And this is where we often see telogen effluvium, which is a type of hair loss that occurs often after a stressful event, but now they are showing that it can happen when you are chronically stressed for a long period of time. And you would see this type of hair loss as shedding and your hair becoming quite thin, but it's not in specific areas. It's just generally your hair becomes a lot thinner, and hair shifts prematurely into that resting shedding phase, the telogen phase, when you have telogen effluvium. And I know people who are taking GLP-1s to lose weight have experienced a lot of hair loss. There are lots of potential reasons for that, dependent on the individual, but this potentially is one of those, because when you are losing weight, it puts a lot of metabolic stress on the body, and could be why people are losing hair when they are losing weight very quickly. But also there could be some nutrient deficiencies and other things going on. This is potentially one of the reasons why that's happening, because as I said, hair loss is not random. It's a physiological response. The body is essentially saying, right now, we need to prioritize other systems and other organs in the body, because from a survival perspective, hair growth is not essential. And this is something I understand not just clinically, but personally as well, because during my own journey with chronic fatigue syndrome, which started during my A-levels, maybe a bit before that, and one of the most striking things is how the body adapts when energy production is compromised. And mitochondria are one of the reasons for that. And these are the structures within our cells that produce energy. And when they become less efficient, you aren't producing enough energy to fuel your body. And when that happens, the body begins to allocate its resources very carefully. It prioritizes what is essential for survival rather than growing hair. And processes like hair growth, which require constant energy and cellular turnover, as I mentioned, are quietly downregulated. So when we see hair loss, we need to ask, what is happening at the level of energy production? If you're experiencing hair loss and you are very tired, or you suddenly started feeling fatigued, or you just don't feel as good as you used to feel, then it might be that your energy production isn't working effectively and you just don't have the energy to support hair growth or the immune system at that point in time. So you need to question, what is the body trying to conserve? Are you doing too much? Have you had an infection which your body still hasn't recovered from? Are there issues in your gut, and that means you're not digesting and absorbing certain nutrients which might be affecting the mitochondria? Or have you been exposed to a toxin which could be affecting your cells and your mitochondria? These are the questions you need to ask. And another important layer is your nutrient status. And this is often where the conversation begins, but it shouldn't be where it ends. Yes, nutrients of course matter, but the hair follicle requires amino acids to build keratin. They require iron to deliver oxygen. They require zinc for cell division and immune regulation, which is so vital when it comes to hair loss. They also require B vitamins for DNA synthesis and cellular replication, which is part of methylation. But what's important to understand is that these nutrients don't act in isolation. They are part of a wider system. So for example, as I mentioned with iron, ferritin, which reflects stored iron, is often very low in individuals experiencing chronic hair shedding. And even if hemoglobin is normal, low ferritin can still affect the follicle because the body prioritises iron for essential functions first. And hair growth, unfortunately, is not one of them. And if you are genetically susceptible to these types of hair loss conditions, then that's going to be the first thing to go. Protein is another key piece because hair is fundamentally made from protein, and in particular amino acids such as cysteine, methionine and lysine play structural roles within keratin, and that's what I want to highlight here in particular. When we think about protein, we always talk about protein, but when we talk about carbohydrates, we talk about different carbohydrates, and when we talk about micronutrients, we talk about the B vitamins, we talk about vitamin C, and we talk about different minerals. But I find with protein, we just talk about protein, and it's not one thing. These amino acids all have different functions in the body, and some of our amino acids are essential. We have to get them from diet. So if you aren't having any methionine or lysine rich foods in your diet, then you won't be getting these amino acids, and that's why it's so vital. One of the questions I got asked in the presentation was about collagen, and I said yes, collagen can be helpful for numerous reasons, but when it comes to being therapeutic and taking nutrients which are very focused on the immune system and hair growth, then it's the amino acids that count rather than the collagen or protein itself. So if your protein intake is low, or you're just getting protein from, say, a plant-based source, then you might not be getting enough. And it could also be that your digestion and absorption are impaired. And that means that the building blocks just aren't there for hair growth, and no amount of supplementation can compensate for that if you are not able to digest these foods either. We also spoke about vitamin D, and this is particularly interesting because the hair follicle contains vitamin D receptors, and vitamin D acts like a hormone. So a hormone acts in the body by being produced, and then there are receptors on the cells which respond to that hormone, and an action happens because of that attachment. And these receptors play a role in signaling the transition into the growth phase. So that's why vitamin D is so important, but also the vitamin D receptors. And you can do a genetic test to see if you have any variations in your vitamin D receptors, which I actually have. And it's something that I speak to my clients about, especially if they have low vitamin D or we need to increase their vitamin D to a certain level. If you have a genetic variation in your vitamin D receptors, it means you don't have as many receptors on your cells, and that will be the same for the hair follicle as well. And because of that, it means that you need a higher amount of vitamin D, because those receptors need a higher source of vitamin D so that you're able to fill all of those receptors, because you don't have many in the first place. So it's quite a good thing to test for, because you're going to know that you are more reliant on vitamin D like I do now. And there are a couple of things that came out of the genetic testing that I did that gave me that insight. And now I know, yes, my body is a bit more reliant on needing a higher amount of vitamin D. That information is really helpful because these are so important in your health and hair growth and your immune health. And knowing that, I can just keep on top of that and maintain a certain level of health because I know that. If you would like to find out more about genetic testing, feel free to send me a message and I can let you know more about the genetic test that I offer in my clinic. I'll put a link to the genetic test DNA Core that I offer in my clinic, but I also work with Life Code, who has some very specific genetic tests around methylation, detoxification, nutrient status. So I can provide some information about that as well, because it is a really helpful test. Now, we often see low vitamin D in individuals with autoimmune hair loss, and that might reflect both immune dysregulation and impaired follicular signaling, because both are important when it comes to autoimmune hair loss. Inflammation is another key driver, and this is where those omega-3 fatty acids come in. Omega-3s help regulate inflammatory pathways, but perhaps more importantly, they give rise to compounds known as specialized pro-resolving mediators. And these molecules help actively resolve inflammation. And that can be a problem, because if that inflammatory process is switched on and turned on and is in a vicious cycle, we need to find a way to resolve it. And it needs to be completed properly. And when that resolution doesn't happen, inflammation can become chronic, and that can disrupt the environment around the follicle. The other layer that is becoming increasingly relevant is environmental exposure. And this includes things like heavy metals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, mold-related toxins. And I've seen this in practice. I worked with a client who had persistent hair loss, and we addressed many of the usual areas: nutrition, gut health, micronutrients, but to be honest, their progress was limited. I was getting frustrated, they were getting frustrated. I suggested that we did some further testing and we look into mould, because they had told me that they had been exposed to mould in the past, and even though the house that they lived in now, they didn't feel like they had any exposure, we decided to take a deeper look and found elevated levels of mycotoxins in their results. What was interesting was that until that exposure was addressed, the body was essentially operating under a constant level of stress. And that's how we need to view these toxins, that they're just putting so much pressure on our body, and everything else becomes deprioritized because the body is just trying to deal with this constant exposure. Then once the burden was reduced, things began to shift, and she started to see hair growth. And then the work that we were doing around her gut health and nutrient-dense foods really started to pay off. And that was when the hair started growing. And once the hair starts growing, the amazing thing is it grows really quickly. And that's where I'm hoping to get to for all of my clients. It can be a frustrating process waiting for the hair to grow. But once the hair grows, and I found this with my own patches, once the hair grows, it grows very quickly. So the body needs a certain level of stability before it starts to invest in growth. And that's where patience is really key. And this brings me to the central message of this episode. Hair loss is not just about the hair. It's about the internal environment. It tells us about energy. It tells us about immune balance. It tells us about nutrient status, and it tells us about stress and resilience. And when we start to see it through that lens, the approach becomes very different. And I think this is a really important place to pause and bring this together into something practical, because one of the questions I'm often asked is, what can I actually do from here? And the truth is, when it comes to hair loss, particularly autoimmune or chronic hair loss, there isn't usually a single quick fix. And the truth is, what we're really doing is creating the right internal environment for the hair to grow again. So if I were to leave you with a few takeaways, it would be this. The first is to understand the hair growth cycle. Hair doesn't respond overnight. Each follicle moves through phases: growth, transition, rest, and shedding. And once the hair is shifted into, the shedding process has to complete, which means that even when you address the root cause, there is often a lag before you see regrowth. And this is where patience becomes so important, because I often see people trying multiple things, one after the other, without giving the body enough time to respond. So not only does it mean that whatever intervention you're doing might not be as effective, it may mean when you get to the end of it, you won't know what worked. You won't have got to that understanding of what was the root cause, so you can maintain a certain level of health. But biologically, the hair takes time to reset. The second thing is to think about cellular health, and particularly methylation. Methylation is involved in a process like DNA synthesis, cell division, and detoxification, all of which are essential for hair follicle function. And it is something I want to speak more about, because the more we understand methylation, the more we can understand our own health and why it's important, and why understanding whether the methylation function in our own body is optimal and ways that we can optimize that as well if it's not. And the cells within the follicle are some of the fastest dividing cells in the body, so we can see why methylation is so important. So anything that impacts methylation, whether it's nutrient deficiencies in folate, B12 or B6, chronic stress, can influence how well these cells replicate and function. And this is why sometimes we need to look beyond surface level nutrients and ask, is the body actually able to use them effectively? And that's one of the tests that I did when I first started working on my health. I started looking into whether I had functional deficiencies in some of the vitamins because I had enlarged red blood cells and my serum B12 levels were really, really high. The doctor was like, you're supplementing way too much in B12. When I looked at it from a functional perspective, I had very high methylmalonic acid, which gives you an indication that you actually are deficient in B12 at that cellular level. And that's when I realized that I needed to take different forms of B12. I was taking a form of B12 that my body couldn't use, the cyanocobalamin. That's the one that I will often avoid when it comes to recommending supplements for my client. I want to look at the adenosyl B12 or the methylcobalamin or the hydroxycobalamin, because these ones are more readily available to your cells and your body. Understanding that is really, really important. The third is to consider what might still be driving stress within the system. And this is where we sometimes uncover layers that haven't been addressed. I mentioned earlier a client I worked with who had been doing everything right. Her nutrition was brilliant. She'd made lots of changes to the foods she was eating. We improved her gut health. Her nutrient deficiencies were being addressed, and yet the hair growth just wasn't happening. And that's when we needed to look deeper, and we found the elevated levels of mycotoxins, and that obviously suggests the mould exposure. And this is important because mold just doesn't sit in the background. It can influence mitochondrial function, immune signaling, and the inflammatory process in the body. And as I mentioned, one of the interesting links with alopecia generally, but with this particular exposure, is the links with mast cells and histamine. And mycotoxins can trigger mast cell activation, which means that they increase the release of histamine into the body and inflammatory markers. And when that signal becomes chronic, it can contribute to the disruption of that immune privilege around the hair follicle, which we know can contribute to hair loss. So the follicle, which is normally protected, becomes more visible to the immune system. So the immune system really shouldn't see components of that. And that's why it looks strange and odd to the immune system. And that's what the immune system is there to do. Anything that looks not quite right, it creates an inflammatory response to get rid of. But we really don't want that when it comes to hair growth. And that's why once we address that layer, reducing exposure, supporting the clearance of these mycotoxins, and calming the immune response, the body is in a very different position. And that's when we start to see those meaningful changes in hair growth. And I think this is the key message. If the body is still dealing with unresolved stress, whether it's inflammation, nutrient depletion, immune activation from something in the body, or environmental exposure, it is much harder for it to prioritize hair growth. If you're experiencing hair loss right now, the question isn't what can I take, what supplement can I take, what topical treatment can I use? It's what does my body need in order to feel safe enough to grow again? And sometimes that means stepping back, looking at the bigger picture, and allowing time for those systems to come back into balance, because hair growth is not just about stimulation and making sure that we get the growth. It's about restoration, not just in the hair follicle, but in the whole body. Before I finish, I just want to say something that feels particularly important to me. One of the areas I care most deeply about is my work in supporting parents of children with alopecia, because I know how emotional that experience can be. And I know how it can feel when you're a child going through this as well. The approach that I took as a child, at first I went to the doctors, I was very open with my parents originally, and then when the hair loss kept coming out, I just dealt with it myself. I didn't really speak to my parents about it. I only spoke to them when it got really bad at one point. I think I was about 14, and I really wanted to go and get my hair highlighted, and I was just so concerned, and I just was embarrassed, and I hadn't had my hair cut in about a year because I just didn't want to go to the hairdressers. And I did speak to my parents then, but it's very difficult when you are experiencing this yourself. And it's hard for parents as well when you just feel like there isn't much you can do. And then you've got to think about being patient and having to kind of go through the motions with it. It's just a very difficult time for everyone involved. And that's why I feel supporting people in that position makes a big difference. And there are lots of things that I'd like to do around this, but at the moment, what I am offering is what I call my Root Reset Circle, where we meet every Tuesday at 5 p.m. and it's just a place for you to come to meet other people who are going through this as well, and for me to help you and provide some insight, and for you to have a space to ask any questions, and to just feel like you are around people who are going through this as well, or who have been through this. So I will put the link for that in the show notes if you would like to join the Root Reset Circle. If you have any questions or you need support, then feel free to reach out as well with any questions that you have. And yeah, I hope you found this episode useful. If you have any questions about anything that I've discussed today, or anything specifically resonated with you, then feel free to pop over to my Instagram account, which is at the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. You can also join my free group, the Autoimmune Forum, if you would like to join a supportive community. There's some guides on there, recipes, so feel free to pop over and join us over there as well. If not, have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Autoimmune Reset. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if you liked it, I would hugely appreciate a review on iTunes, as it helps me understand what you like about the podcast and to help share the information with more people. I'm excited to speak to you next time, and remember, you have the power to take the reins on your health. So keep the faith and celebrate the small wins. Until next time.